October 1944. In the mud-choked forests east of Aachen, a Sherman tank designated Easy 7 sat motionless in a ravine. Its commander crouched beside a length of salvaged canvas and steel links that looked more like a medieval catapult part than anything belonging to a modern war machine. The crew of Easy 7 had laughed when Corporal James Dalton first showed them what he'd been working on for 3 nights straight in the maintenance depot, a jury-rigged ammunition feed system cobbled together from machine gun belts, parachute cord, and stripped tank tread. "Looks like something your kid brother made in shop class," the gunner had said. But Corporal Dalton didn't argue. He just kept stitching canvas and threading steel, because in 6 days, that homemade contraption would be the only thing standing between his crew and annihilation. The question wasn't whether it would work. The question was whether anyone would live long enough to find out. The Hürtgen Forest in autumn 1944 was not a place of romance or glory. It was 90 square miles of primeval darkness where trees grew so thick that sunlight became a rumor and roads became kill zones. The American First Army had been grinding eastward through this nightmare since mid-September, attempting to reach the Roer River and ultimately the Rhine beyond. Every yard cost blood. Every clearing promised ambush. And for armored units, the forest was a death sentence. Narrow fire breaks, soft earth that swallowed treads, and German anti-tank teams that materialized from the shadows like apparitions. Sherman tanks, designed for the open fields of France, became steel coffins. Their crews knew it. Division command knew it. But the orders remained unchanged. Push east, hold ground, support the infantry. So they pushed. Corporal James Dalton was 23 years old, a machinist's apprentice from Duluth, Minnesota, who had joined the Army in early 1942 with romantic visions of tank warfare. Swift columns racing across deserts, turrets blazing, flags snapping in the wind. The reality he found was different. He learned that tanks broke down more often than they fired. He learned that mud was as deadly as ordnance. He learned that the best tanker wasn't the bravest or the fastest. It was the one who could improvise when everything else failed. And in the Hürtgen, everything failed constantly. Radios shorted out in the damp. Tracks through links in the sucking earth. Ammunition feeds jammed when dirt and moisture infiltrated the fighting compartment. It was this last problem that obsessed Dalton during the brief lulls between combat. The Browning M1919 coaxial machine gun mounted beside the Sherman's main cannon was a beautiful weapon in theory, air-cooled, belt-fed, capable of sustained fire at 600 rounds per minute. But it had a fatal flaw in forest fighting. The standard ammunition feed required the assistant gunner to manually guide each belt from the storage box into the receiver, a process that worked perfectly on a firing range but became chaos when the tank was pitching through shell craters and the crew was choking on cordite smoke. Belts twisted. Links separated. The gun went silent at the exact moment it was needed most. Dalton had watched 2 Shermans get swarmed by German infantry the previous week because their coax guns jammed during close assault. He'd heard the screaming over the radio. He'd seen the smoke afterward, and he'd made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if his company commander had known about it. For 3 nights, while the rest of the crew slept in their pup tents or played cards in the motor pool, Dalton worked by flashlight in the back of a supply truck. He requisitioned, or more accurately, stole, components from across the battalion. Machine gun links from a wrecked half-track, canvas webbing from abandoned parachute containers, steel wire from engineering stores, roller bearings from a destroyed German Panther they'd passed 2 days earlier. He studied the interior geometry of Easy 7's turret, measuring angles and clearances with the seamstress's tape his mother had sent him in a care package. The other tankers thought he was obsessive, maybe a little mad. "Dalton's building a Rube Goldberg machine," they joked. But Sergeant Howell, the tank commander, didn't stop him. Howell was a veteran of North Africa and Sicily. He understood that the margin between survival and death often came down to one small innovation, one unexpected advantage. What Dalton designed was brutally simple. A continuous belt system that pre-staged 300 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition in a canvas and steel cradle suspended from the turret roof feeding directly into the Browning's receiver through a guide system made from roller bearings and parachute cord. It eliminated the need for manual belt changes. It eliminated feed jams. It allowed the Koch's gun to fire as long as the barrel could take the heat, theoretically for minutes on end, an eternity in combat time. The engineering was crude. The materials were scavenged. By regulation, it was completely unauthorized. But on October 14, 1944, when Sergeant Howell saw the completed system installed in EZ-7's turret, he didn't order Dalton to remove it. He just nodded slowly and said, "Let's hope we never need to find out if it works." They found out 6 days later. The orders came down on the morning of October 20th. 2nd Platoon, Baker Company, 745th Tank Battalion, would support an infantry advance on the crossroads hamlet of Rafflesbrand, a cluster of stone houses and farm buildings that sat astride the only improved road for 3 miles. Intelligence reported light resistance, a platoon of Volksgrenadiers, maybe a mortar team. The infantry would clear the buildings. The Shermans would provide overwatch and suppress any flanking fire. It was supposed to be a 4-hour operation. By dawn on October 21st, they'd consolidate and push another mile east. Nobody believed the intelligence anymore, but nobody questioned it either. Questioning didn't change the orders. EZ-7 rolled out at 0600 hours. Part of a column of 4 Shermans and 2 companies of infantry from the 28th Division, men who'd been fighting in the Hürtgen for 3 weeks and already had the look of ghosts. The forest was silent except for the grinding of tank engines and the wet sucking sound of boots in mud. Fog clung to the ravines like something living. Visibility dropped to 30 yards. Radio communication crackled and died in the interference of the forest. The column moved slowly, feeling its way forward, every man aware that the German lines were somewhere close, somewhere in the green darkness. Waiting at 0740 hours. The lead Sherman, EZ-5, crested a small rise and exploded. Not from a shell, from a mine. The blast flipped the turret off its ring and sent it cartwheeling into the trees. The crew didn't have time to scream. The column stopped. Infantry scattered into the underbrush. And then the forest came alive with fire. German machine guns opened up from concealed positions on 3 sides. Mortar rounds began dropping with metronomic precision. This wasn't a platoon. This was a prepared defensive position, dug in and waiting. The intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. EZ-7 was 4th in the column, trapped between burning wreckage ahead and soft ground behind. Sergeant Howell made the only decision available. He ordered the driver to pull off the trail into a shallow ravine that offered partial defilade from the mortar fire. The infantry was pinned down. The other 2 Shermans were trying to maneuver, but the forest gave them no room. Radio traffic dissolved into chaos, screaming for medics, calls for fire support that would never come through the forest canopy, commanders trying to coordinate a defense that was already collapsing. And then Howell saw them, German infantry. Not Volksgrenadiers, these were experienced troops, moving in coordinated teams through the trees, using the fog and smoke as cover, advancing on the scattered American positions with the patience of hunters. They carried Panzerfausts, the handheld anti-tank rockets that had become the Sherman killer of choice. One good shot to the rear deck or turret side and EZ-7 would join EZ-5 as a smoking pyre. Howell traversed the turret, shouting coordinates to his gunner. The main gun fired, once, twice, high-explosive shells that detonated in the treetops and sent shrapnel screaming through the German advance. It slowed them. It didn't stop them. That's when Dalton's voice came up from the assistant gunner's position, steady and clear over the intercom. "Sergeant, permission to test the feed system." Howell understood immediately. The Koch's gun had a much higher rate of fire than the main cannon, and in close infantry fighting it was far more effective. But standard doctrine meant they'd get a few bursts before the belt jammed and Dalton would have to reload manually while the tank was under fire. With the homemade system, though, if it worked, they could lay down sustained suppressive fire, something the Germans wouldn't expect from a single tank. Howell didn't hesitate. Do it. The Browning M1919 opened up with a sound like canvas tearing, and it didn't stop. Dalton fed the ammunition through his improvised cradle system. the rollers spinning smoothly, the canvas belt flexing and recovering, the steel links cycling through the receiver without a single jam. Tracers arced into the forest in streams of red light, cutting through fog and foliage, forcing the German infantry to ground. Howell called corrections. The gunner traversed smoothly, and the coax gun kept firing. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. The barrel began to glow faintly even in the dim forest light. The temperature inside the turret spiked until the crew was gasping, but the gun did not stop. The German advance faltered. Infantry that had been moving with confidence suddenly found themselves pinned by fire that shouldn't have been possible from a single tank. They went to ground, trying to wait out what they assumed would be a short burst. But the burst didn't end. Howell fired the main gun again, targeting a suspected machine gun position. The coax continued its mechanical scream. The Americans' infantry, hearing the sustained fire, began to rally, returning fire from their scattered positions. The ambush, so carefully prepared, began to unravel. And EZ-7, sitting in its shallow ravine with a homemade ammunition system that looked like it belonged in a barn, became the anchor point of a defense that should have collapsed in the first 5 minutes. But 4 hours is an eternity in combat, and the day was only beginning. The German return fire found them at 0823 hours. A Panzerschreck round, the heavier cousin of the Panzerfaust, streaked out of the fog and impacted the ravine wall 6 feet to EZ-7's left, showering the hull with stone fragments and frozen earth. The concussion inside the tank was like being struck with a hammer. Dalton's teeth rattled, his vision blurred, but his hands never stopped moving, feeding the belt, watching the brass casings pour out of the ejection port in a golden stream that piled up around his boots. The smell inside the turret had become something beyond description. Cordite, hot metal, sweat, and the acrid sweetness of overheating oil. The temperature had climbed past 100 degrees despite the October cold outside. Sergeant Howell's voice came through the intercom, calm as a man ordering breakfast. "Traverse left, 10 degrees. Tree line, 200 yards. I see movement." The gunner, Private First Class Eddie Kaczmarek, was a coal miner's son from Scranton who'd fired expert on every weapon the Army put in his hands. And right now his hands were moving with the precision of a surgeon. He adjusted Travers, elevated slightly to account for the slope, and triggered another main gun round. The 75mm shell screamed out and detonated in an airburst above the German position, shredding pine branches and sending bodies tumbling. Before the smoke cleared, Dalton had the coax gun on target, walking tracers across the tree line in methodical sweeps. The Browning's rate of fire had slowed slightly, not from jamming, but from heat. The barrel was approaching temperatures that would normally mandate a change. But there was no time for barrel changes. There was only the next second, and the second after that, and the hope that the metal would hold together long enough to matter. By 0900 hours, EZ-7 had fired over 800 rounds through the coaxial gun. Dalton's improvised feed system had cycled flawlessly, the canvas cradle swaying with the turret's movement, the roller bearings, stolen from a dead panther, spinning smooth as silk. The other crew members had stopped thinking about whether it would fail. They'd entered that strange space of sustained combat where time becomes elastic and thought reduces to pure function. Load. Aim. Fire. Breathe. Repeat. The world outside the vision blocks was chaos, smoke, fog, the stutter of machine guns, the crump of mortars, screaming in German and English and that universal language of pain that needs no translation. But inside EZ-7 there was only the rhythm of the guns and Howell's steady voice calling targets. The American infantry was still pinned, scattered in a perimeter maybe 200 yards across, using shell craters and fallen logs for cover. EZ-7 had become their fire base, the one source of sustained suppressive fire that kept the German assault teams from overrunning their positions. But the tank couldn't move. Forward was the burning wreck of EZ-5, still cooking off ammunition in sporadic bangs. Behind was soft ground that would bog the tracks. Left and right were trees too dense for a Sherman to navigate. They were stuck in that ravine, and every German soldier in the sector was starting to understand that if they could kill that one tank, The American defense would collapse like wet paper. At 09:20, the German mortars found their range. The first round hit 20 feet short. The second hit 10 feet long. The third impacted directly on the ravine's edge, close enough that shrapnel rang off EZ-7's hull like hail on a tin roof. Howell didn't flinch. He'd been through this before, in Tunisia, in Sicily, on Omaha Beach. He knew that mortar fire was a mathematics problem. The Germans were walking their rounds onto target, and in another minute or two they'd score a direct hit on the turret or engine deck, and that would be the end. The only solution was to eliminate the mortar team before they could complete their calculations. He scanned through his periscope, looking for the telltale smoke signature of a mortar position, and found it. A flicker of gray against darker gray, maybe 400 yards northeast, partially concealed in a drainage ditch. Gunner, reference mortar position, 4 o'clock. 400. Kosmarek traversed, acquired, fired. The high-explosive round landed 30 yards short, throwing up a geyser of mud. Howell corrected. Add 50, fire again. Another round, closer. The German mortar team kept firing. Professionals who knew their survival depended on killing the tank before the tank killed them. Another 81mm round screamed down and hit 15 feet to the right, close enough that the concussion made Dalton's ears ring even through his helmet. He tasted blood where he'd bitten his tongue. The Coke's gun had gone through over 1,000 rounds now. The barrel was glowing visibly, a cherry-red sunrise inside the green darkness of the Hürtgen. He could feel the heat radiating through his gloves. The canvas of his improvised feed system had begun to char where it passed closest to the receiver. But the belt kept moving. Kaczmarek fired a third time. The shell landed directly in the drainage ditch, and the mortar team ceased to exist. The incoming fire stopped. For perhaps 10 seconds there was something approaching quiet. Just the idling of EZ-7's engine and the distant rattle of small arms. Then Howell's voice. "Reload main gun. Stand by." The loader, a replacement whose name Dalton could never remember because replacements rarely lived long enough for names to matter, wrestled another 75mm shell from the ready rack and slammed it home. The breech closed with a satisfying clang. The gun was ready, and the forest erupted again. This time it was coming from the south, a direction that had been quiet until now. German infantry in company strength, maybe more, advancing through the smoke and fog in a coordinated assault. This wasn't a probe or harassment. This was a deliberate attempt to crush the American pocket before reinforcements could arrive. Howell could see them through the breaks in the vegetation. Feldgrau uniforms moving in short rushes, covering each other with practiced efficiency. These weren't the old men and boys of the Volksgrenadier units. These were Heer regulars, possibly even Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers who'd been pulled from other sectors to hold the Hürtgen. They moved like men who'd spent years learning their trade in Russia, in France, in 100 forgotten villages. And they were very good at killing. The American infantry saw them coming and opened fire, but rifles and a few bars weren't going to stop an assault of that size. The Germans would close to grenade range, then rush the positions in a final surge that would end with bayonets and entrenching tools, and the kind of close-quarters butchery that didn't make it into the newsreels. Unless EZ-7 could break their momentum. Howell made a decision that violated every tactical doctrine he'd ever learned. He ordered the driver to move forward, out of the protective defilade of the ravine, onto the exposed slope where the tank would be visible and vulnerable but where its guns could sweep the entire southern approach. The driver, a kid from Alabama named Pettigrew who'd been shaking since the first mortar round, hesitated for maybe half a second. Then he engaged the transmission and gunned the engine. EZ-7 lurched up and out of the ravine, tracks clawing at mud and roots, the hull tilting at an angle that made every man inside grab for handholds. They crested the lip and stopped on the slope, broadside to the German advance, every square inch of the tank exposed. It was suicide tactics. It was also the only play that might work. Dalton swung the Coke's gun south and opened fire before Howell even gave the command. The improvised feed system swayed wildly as the tank settled on the uneven ground, but the belt never fouled. Tracers poured into the advancing Germans in streams that looked solid, like ropes of red light connecting the tank to the forest. Men fell, others dove for cover. The assault wavered. Kaczmarek fired the main gun into a cluster of troops, the explosion sending bodies cartwheeling through the air in a grotesque ballet. The loader was already ramming another shell home. The breach closed. Kaczmarek fired again, and the Koch's gun never stopped. 1,500 rounds. 2,000. The barrel was beyond any safe operating temperature, glowing bright enough to light up the turret's interior like a forge. The heat was so intense that the paint on the gun shield was bubbling. Dalton's gloves were smoking. His hands were blistering inside them, but he didn't dare stop feeding the belt because stopping meant dying. The German assault broke against that sustained fire like waves against a seawall. Men who'd survived Stalingrad and Kursk found themselves pinned by a single tank that refused to go silent, that kept firing when any reasonable crew would have ceased, that poured round after round into their positions with mechanical, inhuman persistence. At 10:15 hours, nearly 3 hours after the ambush began, the barrel of the Browning M19-19 warped. Not catastrophically. Just a slight bend, maybe 2 degrees, but enough that the rounds began to drift right of where Dalton aimed. He compensated instinctively, adjusting his point of aim to account for the deviation, and kept firing. The feed system was holding, but barely. The canvas was charred black and smoking. 2 of the roller bearings had seized from heat and had to be bypassed by Dalton's bleeding hands working by feel in the smoke-filled turret. The parachute cord had melted and been replaced on the fly with wire scavenged from the radio set, which had stopped working an hour earlier anyway. The system looked like it had been assembled by madmen, but it functioned. The Germans tried one more push at 10:45, a desperate assault led by an officer Howell could see through his periscope, a tall man with a knight's cross at his throat who stood upright urging his men forward even as tracers snapped past his head. Kaczmarek put a main gun round 10 feet from him and the officer disappeared in the blast. The German attack died with him. The surviving troops pulled back into the forest, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. The firing slackened, then stopped. The forest fell into an exhausted quiet, broken only by the moaning of the wounded and the crackling of fires and Easy 7's engine. Still running, still ready. Inside the tank, Dalton finally stopped feeding the belt. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't have threaded another link if his life depended on it. The Koch's gun fell silent for the first time in over 3 hours, the barrel ticking as it cooled, the metal contracting with sounds like small-caliber gunfire. The air in the turret was unbreathable, a toxic soup of fumes and smoke that made every breath burn. The temperature was 120 degrees. Every surface was too hot to touch with bare skin. The floor was ankle-deep in spent brass casings, over 2,500 of them, each one ejected through Dalton's improvised system, each one representing a German soldier pinned or killed or driven back. Sergeant Howell opened his hatch and stood up in the commander's cupola, breathing air that tasted like winter and cordite and survival. He could see American infantry beginning to move, consolidating positions, tending to wounded. He could see the smoking wreckage that marked where German assault teams had been caught in the open. And he could see, in the distance, the shapes of more Shermans approaching, reinforcements that had finally fought their way through the forest. The battle for this unnamed ravine was over. Easy 7 had held. But when Howell climbed down into the turret to check on his crew, he found Dalton slumped against the ammunition racks, his hands wrapped in shredded canvas, his face gray with exhaustion and shock, staring at the homemade feed system that no longer looked like a joke. It looked like the only reason any of them were still breathing. And as medics began arriving to treat the infantry wounded, as officers started shouting orders to establish a perimeter, as the machinery of war ground forward into the next hour and the next crisis, nobody was laughing anymore. They were counting the cost, and wondering if genius looked like madness until the moment it saved your life.